In the face of daunting economic and financial challenges, members of the rate-fixing arm of the Central Bank of Nigeria, well, of course, that's the Monetary Policy Committee, have voted for an upward review of the monetary policy rate. That's from 13% to 14%. It's part of measures to sustain rising inflationary pressure, leaving other parameters unchanged. But this development will be the second interest rate hikes in 2 months. If that's as the committee scales the voting hurdle as the just concluded meeting. It will be recalled that the committee in its last meeting in May 2022 moved the benchmark rate up by 150 basis points from 11.5% to 13%, whilst retaining other key parameters. Well, joining me live in our Lagos studio to do some analysis, of course, on the outcomes of the resolutions made by the Monetary Policy Committee of the CBN. I introduced him earlier. He's an economist and tax manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Abiodun Kayode. Thank you so much. It's great to have you in the studio. What were you expecting? Truth be told, we planned to discuss this. We were looking at the projections. But now the CBN Monetary Policy Committee came up with another 100 basis points increase. Was that what you were expecting?
To be quite honest, it wasn't what I was expecting.
Same here. I wasn't expecting that. Why?
Okay, so the reason I wasn't expecting that was because I think it's close.
Yes.
Looking at from May, when they had that first increase by 150 basis points, and if you consider the structure of the kind of inflationary trend we are dealing with. First of all, if you look at traditional definition of inflation, you are looking at a situation whereby you have a lot of money going after few goods, right? That's the traditional basis. So by the time the Monetary Policy Committee, by the time they raise rates, what they are trying to do is that they are trying to encourage people to save more, right? Save more rather than spend. But if you look at what we are going through right now, we're going through a supply side inflationary tendency, a structural side inflation problem, right? Which is coming as a result of supply constraint, as a result of the war in Europe, which is causing prices, global food prices and energy prices to be on the increase. So I would have expected a hold stance, and I would have expected a little more of monitoring to see the impact of that last increase on the economy as of now. Because if you think about it, what exactly does the MPC do by raising rates? Raising rates, simply what they are doing is they are increasing the cost of borrowing, and they are also trying to adjust for macroeconomic indicators. But looking at the situation of things right now, yes, it will be some benefit to some form of investment, right? And one could also think of it as a way of trying to stem the tide of capital outflow. Because this decision that the MPC has taken, it can be a way of seeing a lot of investors, portfolio investors, have actually moved their capital to advanced economies, right? As a result of advanced economies raising their own rates, because it's favorable and the risk premium, the risk is low, right, compared to what we have in developing economies. So I think that's also another reason why they might have taken that decision. Well, I can understand that the IMF has actually expects most monetary policy committees across the world, most CBN central banks to actually increase rate. That's the expectation of the IMF, and monetary policy committee has done that. So let's just look at the impact.
Impact there. This is obviously fueled by rising prices of food, which we talked about in the first arm of the show, and of course, high costs of energy. Now, energy, not even just diesel. We know what's been happening with fuel scarcity. We know what we've seen. But in all of this, it seems to be a global issue. So how do we attack it locally? The CBN governor have always said they're looking for non-conventional policies to address most of the challenges that we face as a country. In your analysis, because I know you look at all of this and, come up with reports, what's the impact of some of these interventions, basic ones from the central bank that we've had in recent times?
Okay, I think we all know that the CBN has been involved in a lot, and it's quite commendable what they've done. Sticking with the first aspect of it, right, the conventional measures of you raising rates. Further to what I said earlier, I can understand the sentiment, and the sentiment is simply this: inflation has been a key problem for most economies of the world. I'm sure you've been hearing reports of record reports. By the time they are now announcing inflation of some countries, you hear records such as 40-year high. When you look at economies like the United States and also the United Kingdom, right? So that is quite understandable. Even when it comes to developing countries here like Ghana, right? You hear situations whereby they are having down inflation at a record high as well. Well, we understand that. Is it addressing a problem? That's another issue. With respect to the other policy measures that has been taken by the CBN, I think one key one, which you could say to a reasonable extent might be responsible for even the increase in our reserves. I'm sure you've seen reports that our reserves have come back from $38 billion to about $39 billion. Well, I think from the report I saw with respect to the RT200, that's the raise to the $200 billion that the CBN is trying to generate, we understand that in the first half of the year, the release that has been made by exporters to the reserves, right, has been something around the range of $2.4 billion, right? If you compare it to what we used to have in previous years, we used to have something within the range of $900 million, right? But 2.4, I think that's quite significant. Then apart from that, there are also some other intervention measures that the CBN has actually put in place, such as trying to support the electricity sector in terms of mass metering. There's been lots of funds that has been released. And also, if you even look at it in terms of the pandemic, right, to support the manufacturing sector, to support households, the CBN has actually been doling out lots of money, right? So carrying out all these measures to a reasonable extent, it has been able to help lots of businesses that should have gone underwater as a result of the impact of the pandemic, right? But they are able to still stay strong and stay alive. And I know the CBN has this program that it normally does, that it shows how its impact with respect to small and medium scale businesses, their operations, how they've been able to survive. I mean, there are hubs that the CBN has put in place in different key locations, right? Those hubs, what they are designed to do is to ensure that any form of support that these small and medium scale businesses need, they get it in terms of power, in terms of access to infrastructure. So all these things are actually commendable. But the question is it enough? Is it enough? There's still a long way to go when it comes to development, when it comes to issues that we need to address, structural issues. And I think a lot of them actually sit in the hands of the fiscal side. I heard your last guest talking about food security, and it's a very big issue indeed. Because like we said, the key component of that is driving inflation is actually food inflation, which is now at 20%, right? And you are looking at a situation whereby farmers cannot go to their farm. They are being abducted. And we're not just talking about the high-profile kidnaps. There are a lot of things that are going on that you don't know until you talk to people who are residing there. So you have farmers who have even planted, but they can't even go there to harvest, right? So these are key issues that we're talking about. And logistics. Logistics is quite key. The global increase in energy prices, because if you consider the cost of transporting food produce from where they are produced to where they are being consumed, you are talking about using most of these diesel-powered vehicles, right? And the cost of diesel, I hear it's somewhere within the range of 815 naira per liter. So these are some of the structural issues. So the CBN has done its part, which is quite commendable, and it's not going to relent on that, right? But there is still more. There are a lot of issues that we need to talk about. You don't talk about issues of FX. That can be the answer.
Let's go there.
Okay.
An average manufacturer today would need, for example, $10,000. And according to what we've heard, we've spoken to them as journalists, they will tell us that after days, they will get, at times, not even about 1/10 of what they request from the central bank. These guys have to import raw materials because we don't have many of these materials in country. So already, it's affecting business. Diesel, you mentioned it, more than 800 naira for a liter. People had already calculated their return on investment before now. They've planned. Now this is affecting it because as of January, diesel was about 300 naira per liter. Where do we stand? And what effect will all of this have moving forward?
Well, it complicates our issue as a country. It complicates our issue as a country. But to start with the FX, right? So the FX, to a reasonable extent, that lies in the hand of the central bank. Yeah, the FX policy.
Can they sustain this?
To be quite honest with you, you see, the problem with Nigeria is that our demand for the FX actually outweighs the supply. It does outweigh the supply. the CBN still has issues with there's a backlog. There's a backlog of demand for
Yes.
that FX, right? A lot of companies that have come here to invest, foreign direct investment, they need to remit, but they are having issues, right? So there's still a backlog. Not to talk of the demand that is constantly increasing. And I'm sure
By the
you
day.
must have seen some of your banks say something like, okay, there is going to be a quota, there's going to be a restriction to the amount of FX they can even give you as individuals. And like you rightly said, there is a time lag. By the time you make that request for the FX, before you get it, it takes quite a long
Exactly.
time.
So you don't have a choice. You have to use the other market.
You know, the director general of the what's it called, the budget, that's
Okay. Ben Akabueze.
Ben Akabueze was making mention about this scarcity of dollar being a big issue, right? Then also, I don't even think the CBN has enough to defend the naira, right?
no.
So it's actually
Obviously.
a big problem. And I remember in February, the CBN made a comment, I think February or January, the CBN made a comment about banks now being developing themselves to the point whereby they will now be getting their own FX to supply to the public. But you can see that can't happen, right? And even with the what's it called? Even with the suspension of funds to the BDCs, we were expecting that. You know, there were lots of reports from bankers coming out to say that the value of the naira is going to go up, but sadly, that's not the case. So it's actually a big issue. What is something I see that can be a solution? So if you even consider it, like you rightly said, we are actually an import-dependent nation. Most of the things we need, even for production and for consumption, they're actually imported. And because they are coming from abroad, you need FX to source to get these items into the country. So I think a big thing that we need to do is that we need to try as much as we can to look for a way to substitute most of our demands, right? In terms of consumption, we need to try and look inwards. Wheat, for instance, I know most of us like eating bread with wheat because of the taste. And I know there's been times whereby they've been trying to, the government has tried to substitute wheat for cassava, right? And I know most Nigerians fought against it because of the taste. But the honest truth here is that we might have to have this debate again, right? Because if you consider it, that's why the price of your bread is no longer 500 naira the way it used to be as at the beginning of this year. You now get it for about 850, 900 naira, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of import substitution. There needs to be a lot of production that we need to do locally, right? We have the land, right? There's the fertile land. But like I said, you also need the federal government to actually substitute, right? Then with respect to consumption as well,
Yes.
I think we need to do a lot with respect to our taste for foreign items. Yeah, I think we need to do a lot in that respect, because at this current rate, we just can't sustain that the CBN can't sustain that supply of the FX that is being demanded. Then when it comes to what are the other things that we also need this FX for? When it comes to education, when it comes to schooling, right? Because you have a lot of people who actually school abroad, right? And they need this for their travels and for their fees, right? I think we need to do a lot when it comes to even our education sector, which is currently in a state of comatose, right? So there are a lot of policies that we need to consider when it comes to looking inwards. Then with respect to that first point I made, when the CBN suspended giving out funds to the BDCs, right? I think one thing we need to do is that the CBN came out and said it boldly that this is going to make our lives better, because every policy they come out to give is actually meant to help the common man. But the question is it helping the common man? I don't think so. I think some of the policies that the CBN actually gives, they need to test. It needs to be practicable, right? It needs to be something that has that sense of test. Has it been tested, right? Because if it hasn't been tested, it just throws the whole economy into uncertainty and it makes life complicated. We were thinking that things would get better, but have things gone better in terms of the price of the naira compared to dollar? It hasn't. So,
at that time, I think it was about 400 and something, or 500.
yes,
it
wasn't up to 500. It wasn't up to 500. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I remember a situation where this popular musician Davido was crying when he said that he's now changing the naira, the dollar with 500 naira. Now we're talking about 620 naira. And like you rightly said, how many of these businesses that need these particular dollars, how many of them can they source from the official exchange?
Clearly, what that means is you source from the parallel market.
Yes.
It comes back to your business. Yes. So the consumers or those buying would have to pay the price.
Yeah, that's
so it is a ripple effect.
Yes.
And our purchasing power almost remains the same.
Sadly, that's the case.
This is
We're talking
scary.
about minimum wage of 30,000.
Yeah.
That sadly, it really can't do much when you consider the price of a bag of rice right
Yeah.
now, because the price of a bag of rice is competing with the
Yeah.
minimum wage,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, it's there's a lot to be concerned about. There's a lot to be concerned about, especially with respect to the vulnerable, right? Especially with respect to the vulnerable. I do agree that inflation is something that is spiraling out of control. It's a global issue, and it's something that needs to be addressed. But the measures with which we address them, I think that is just the issue right now. Because if you consider it, based on the rates, you have actually increased the cost of borrowing, right? You've actually increased the cost of borrowing. And in doing that, you've also stimulated the financial institutions to invest in the fixed income market, because by implication, it would also lead to an improvement in rates, right, from the fixed income market. And the question here is, are you not crowding out the private sector who is in need of funds? It's because the money that should be going to the private sector will be competed for by the federal government,
Yeah.
right? So these are issues that are coming out from this rate hike, but I'm sure they all know what they are doing, because it was a unanimous decision from what I heard. So we would have to see some of the comments which they came up
These
with.
guys, the MPC guys, we could call them the big boys. These are the guys determining what's happening with our economy. Yeah, that's the way it is. Whatever message that comes out from here is what investors listen to, and that's what makes them, that's what shapes their investment decision. But let's wrap up on this note. Are they getting enough support from the fiscal side? All of these guys, because that is very important. Mr. Biodo. And adding up to that, what's the expectation of the next meeting? I believe they will hold on.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. I don't see the I really don't see the wisdom in hiking rates any further at the next MPC committee meeting. Now, with respect to what you said, the support from the fiscal side, very key. In fact, the three things that the IMF recommended, even though the first one, I think they needed to have clarified. The three things that the IMF chief recommended recently was that the first thing was that countries across the world should fight inflation with everything they have.
Yeah.
The second thing has to do with, which is what you just asked, the second thing has to do with the fiscal side. The fiscal side is expected to support, right? Support in such a way that it helps the vulnerable households. And you know, we've heard this issue of the subsidies so many times. We've talked about it. The question is, the subsidies, is it going exactly to the vulnerable households, or is it going to even the rich and the average, the okay, like me and you,
No,
right?
no, like people like you that have 3, 4 cars.
Okay, so I think it should actually be done in such a way that it's going to the vulnerable. And I think the third thing has to do with food security, which is a big issue. I think for those two things, the second and the third, the federal government has a huge role to play. They have a huge role to play. And thankfully, NNPC is being commissioned today.
So
NNPC Limited is being launched today, right? And we don't expect to be seeing on that recovery, or we don't expect to be hearing much of it. We expect to be seeing the dividends, and we expect actual remittance to go into the Nigerian economy. So I think the fiscal side, they are not doing as much as they should. We expect more from them. That's the way I look at it.
As we move towards the elections, that's another thing, you know.
Yes.
So we don't know what we'll be playing, but we're keeping a tab on them. Interesting conversation as usual with you. I must thank you so much, Mr. Abiodun Kaode Ali. He's an economist and tax manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, always there to break down the figures for us as usual. Thank you so much. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Tolu.